Okay, welcome back, zoologists. This podcast is going to concern the Rotifera, otherwise known as the rotifers. So what you see on this phylogeny here, so all of this should be familiar. So I'm leading you up to this clade right here. So recall that we've entered into the bilateria already. We're in the protostomes. We're still talking about the Lophotrochozoans. And a couple of points I'd like to make briefly is this clade does really have a name. It's called the Platyzoa. So this clade is diagnosed on the basis of molecular characters only. There's no single morphological feature that tells you the name for this or allows you to identify members of this clade. And the term Platyzoa, by definition, basically means flat animals. So platy is flat, zoa is animals. So this is the flat animal clade. Makes sense. And we've already talked about the platyhelminthes, the flatworms, but we're talking about these guys, the rotifers. I'm not actually going to talk about the acanthocephala, so you can skip this clade. So let's zoom in a little bit closer into this part of the phylogeny. Oh, sorry. I need to tell you about these two terms, which I'm going to do on the next slide, the Gnathifera and the Syndermata. So let me take you to the next slide. So this is a picture from your book. And let me just orient you. So here's the flatworms. And see these terms above. So clearly this is part of the Lophotrochozoa. It extends further out here. And this whole clade is the Platyzoa, the flat animals. And there's several things that we're going to skip in here. But those two terms that you just saw in the phylogeny, Gnathifera and Syndermata, are here. So let me introduce you to these terms. So all of these organisms here are referred to as the Gnathifera. So gnath means mouth or jaws. And they are characterized by, and you can see the feature here, cuticular jaws with unique microstructure. Well, what does that mean? Well, you know what jaws are. So these are rigid structures within your mouth that actually give your mouth support. And you usually use them for chewing or masticating, and that's what jaws are usually used for. Cuticular jaws in this case means that those jaws are not derived from bones, but from part of the cuticle, which is part of the endoskeleton or exoskeleton, depending on the organism that you're talking about. So here's a picture of a stylized picture of the jaws that these organisms may have, or something like it. So these are jaws, and they say with unique microstructure, and it basically means they're funkadelic like these, like they're really bizarre. They have lots of little teeth-like structures or pointy structures that are made for chewing up their food items. So all of the Gnathifera are characterized by cuticular jaws with unique microstructure. Now within the Gnathifera is a group called the Syndermata. And these guys are characterized by having a eutelic syncytial epidermis. Well, so you know epidermis is skin, and up until now we haven't talked about a true epidermal layer. We've talked about a tegument, so an outside covering to the body, and we've talked about a syncytial tegument, but this is an epidermis. So what that means is there are several layers to the skin, so there is a skin that you're going to see in these organisms and beyond. But in this case, the outermost part of the epidermis is syncytial. You already know what this means. So it's multinucleate cells, and we talked about this previously, right? So here's sort of a stereotyped version of what your cells look like. So you have independent cells. Each one has a nucleus on the inside. So indicated here by the squares and the circles. But when it's syncytial, the membranes between the cells basically breaks down, and what you have is one large cell that's multinucleate. So these guys have an epidermal layer that's made of these syncytial cells. So what does eutelic mean? So utile, or eutelic, means having a fixed number of cells. So the members in the Syndermata, the Rotifera and the Acanthocephala, they have a fixed number of cells that form this outer layer of their epidermis, and it's multinucleate. Now, depending on the species, different species have different numbers of cells that are on the outside of their epidermis. So I can't tell you like, yeah, all of them have exactly 100 or whatever the number might be. But just know that every individual has exactly the same number of cells, and those cells on the outside are syncytial, so they're multinucleate. Okay, So now let's go into the Rotifera itself. So rotifers are really interesting creatures, and we're talking about them for a couple of reasons. One is that you're going to hear references to them throughout your life, and they are very interesting organisms that you can find globally. They're in just about every kind of habitat. They're marine, they're freshwater, they are aquatic, and they do have some interesting conceptual features that we need to cover as well. But first, let's talk about their general morphology. So this is roughly what they look like, although there's over 2,000 species of rotifers, and they do vary, and I'll show you some pictures. But they tend to have this general structure. They have toes with adhesive glands, and so they can adhere and be kind of sessile and be attached to a particular surface. But they do swim around quite actively as well with their corona up here at the top. So here's some pictures of a variety of different rotifers, but they all kind of have a similar sort of gestalt about them. They have this ciliated crown called a corona that they use for feeding as well as for assisting in their swimming. Up to now, we haven't seen subdivisions of the body in animals like you may be used to, but now we're going to start to see, because of this increased cephalization and this bilateral symmetry, you're going to start seeing head regions, body regions, and then trunk regions, as you see here with this rotifer. These guys are characterized by having a muscular mastoc. So basically, and we talked about this unique cuticular microstructure to the jaws, so now they actually have an organ that allows them to physically start breaking down their food before they ingest it. This is a major innovation. So up until now, the organisms that we've been looking at have basically been grabbing particles of food or bits of food, ingesting it, and it starts to be broken down by enzymes extracellularly, so outside the cells, and then some of that nutrition is brought into the cells and it's further broken down within the cells. What that means is that there's a limitation to the size of the particles that they can eat, which also is going to limit their nutrition, okay, and how quickly they can absorb that nutrition and make use of it in their bodies. With the advance of having jaws, you can now eat bigger particles or bigger food items. You can physically begin to break it down so that you can digest it. And then, of course, as those smaller bits get into your digestive system, it can be further broken down. It also opens up the resources that you can utilize that are in the environment. So before, you might not have been able to eat big items. Now you can. That's a resource that opens up to you and becomes available. Oh my God, sparklers, fireworks. We now have our first organism that has a true anus. This is also, not a true, but an anus. This is a huge evolutionary innovation as well. Remember, up until now, the organisms that we've been covering lack this. And what that meant was, in terms of eliminating their digestive waste, they had to eliminate it out through the same place it went in. If you think about that, the problem with that is it's inefficient, and it also disrupts the digestive process. So as you're digesting food, you have to pause and basically get rid of all those waste products. With an anus, you don't have to do that. You can begin digesting food at your mouth end, and it can continually be being digested. Waste can be eliminated in a continual path leading outside your body. You don't have to disrupt the digestive process in order to eliminate those wastes. So this is a huge innovation, which means that you can now consume more nutrients, you can grow, you can put more energy into not only growth, but into reproduction as well, defense. So this opens up whole new universes when you have both chewing mouth parts and a complete digestive system. So these guys, so last time you were introduced to protonephridia. So protonephridia are like primitive kidneys that are composed of these flame cells. So rotifers have these flame cells as well. They're a little further developed than what we saw last time. And they empty into what's called a cloacal bladder. So this is a new concept for you. So what's a cloaca? So cloaca is actually derived from Latin and Greek and literally means sewer, which is kind of gross. But what it basically means is that before, so when you're looking on animals, you usually see an external opening that is the anus. But there's more than one product that actually is discharged from the anus. So you might have digestive waste, you might have metabolic waste, so think urine. You might also have reproductive aspects. So you might have eggs, you might have sperm, or you might even have, if you're female, let's say, you might actually have babies that are discharged through the same single opening. So instead of having separate openings for digestive waste and a separate one for metabolic waste and a separate one for reproductive interests, it's all coming out the same opening. And so when you go into that opening, there is what you might think of as a lobby, is the word some people use. I think that's kind of odd, but anyway, there's an opening. And so that opening is called the cloaca. And in this case, you have all those same products that are actually coming together in the cloaca and then being discharged. In this case, it's called a bladder because it actually has a muscular structure around the opening that will actually hold the contents until they're ready to be released. Okay, now these guys also have some somewhat better developed sensory organs than what we saw in the last group as well. So they have a brain, which you can see in a simple diagram here. They have eye spots, which are simplified, so they can detect light and dark, vague shapes, but no clear and distinct shapes. They certainly don't see in color. They have all kinds of sensory pits that are around towards their head end, and some might be sprinkled throughout the body for detecting not only vibrations in the water, but chemosensation as well. So now you're looking at an organism that, despite being small and simplified, it does have an advanced nervous system over the flatworms. Now, one of the major concepts that I want to cover with the rotifers as an example, oh, and by the way, before I forget, I need to tell you that these guys are coelomate organisms, okay? Okay, moving on. So rotifers are one of many animals that exhibit parthenogenesis. So this term right here. So parthenogenesis is when you're able to reproduce. So when you have sexually dimorphic organisms, so they're dioecious, and they can reproduce without the need to exchange genes. So in other words, females don't need males to do it. Now, different animals that we're going to study along the way can do this in a number of different ways. So there's different ways to be parthenogenetic, and rotifers do it in a really, really unique way. And so I want you to understand how this works. So rotifers can reproduce in a couple of different ways. And let me back up a step. So many of you may have not had genetics, but hopefully you've had enough genetic instruction either in high school or so far in your classes that you can follow me. But recall, right, that when you have eggs and sperm, you have half the genetic complement from your mom and from your dad. And when they come together and form a zygote, which is going to form into you, then you have both those genetic complements, and so you are called diploid. So that means you have two sets of chromosomes. Okay, and we represent that. The tradition is to write 2N to represent that you have the genetic complements from mom and dad together combined. If you were to look at the genes within just the egg or just the sperm, we represent that as haploid, or just a single N. Okay? So if you look at all the cells in your body right now, they're all diploid, except for your gametes, except for your eggs and sperm. So all your cells are diploid, 2N. Your gametes are 1N. So female rotifers can produce two kinds of eggs. They're called mictic eggs and amictic eggs. Okay? Maybe it's easiest to remember them this way. Mictic means haploid eggs. So mictic is half. Amictic are diploid eggs. So these are the same as regular eggs. Mictic are regular eggs. These are kind of unusual eggs. So these are what you would normally have in any typical female. So they're haploid eggs. These ones have 2N. With amictic eggs, so they can basically begin to divide on their own through through environmental cues they begin to divide several times, undergoing those cleavage, and they continue to divide until they form a fully formed rotifer. So remember, we've talked about similar things to this. So we've talked about budding and fission. But the thing about budding or fission, if you can think about, if this was a single organism, all you have to do is like, rip off a part of yourself, and then that's going to repair the injury, and it's going to grow and develop into a single full-fledged organism, and this thing's going to develop into a full-fledged organism, right? So that's like fission or budding. But imagine in this case what's happening is you actually take, so it's not like fission. So as opposed to like taking my little frog here and like cutting it in half, which could never happen, but cutting it in half and then it repairing itself and developing into two complete individuals, it's not quite like that. In this case, what's happening is you have so you're not cutting something in half, you actually take an egg, and instead of fertilizing it, it doesn't need to be fertilized, it can just continue to develop normally into a fully fledged adult. So that's what amictic eggs do. Mictic eggs are typical haploid eggs, and here's where it gets complicated. If it's not fertilized, then it's going to become a haploid male. Okay, so it's going to stay haploid, but it's going to be a male. And those males, when they exist in the population, they mate with females to produce diploid eggs that will then hatch into diploid females. Okay, so let me show this to you in another way. So imagine you have a diploid egg here. If nothing happens, if no sperm shows up, it's going to develop into a typical girl rotifer, okay, a diploid female. And then the eggs of that female can either be fertilized or not fertilized. If they're not fertilized, then you just have this happening again and again and again. If they're not fertilized, when certain times of the year happen and when certain environmental cues are present, it's just going to begin, the eggs will begin to divide and you'll form diploid females. Okay? But if you have a haploid egg, okay, and sometimes they can do this, if you produce haploid eggs and that's not fertilized, that's going to make a haploid boy. Okay? But if the egg is fertilized, so if a haploid egg, a mictic egg, and so they have a mix of mictic and amictic eggs. I probably should have said that at the beginning. They have a mix of mictic and amictic eggs. If a mictic egg is fertilized, then that will form a diploid individual and you'll get a girl. Okay? So you can get females in the population either through fertilization of a mictic egg or through the cloning ability of a diploid egg. Okay? I know, it's very confusing. I'm going to go over this again in class, and I'm going to have an activity for you to do to hopefully reinforce this concept. It's pretty odd, but just bear with me for now. We're going to explain it more in class. I just wanted to introduce the concept to you now in this podcast so that you'll be familiar with it, and then we'll talk about it in more detail. So don't worry, the details of this will not be on the quiz, but I do want you to know what mictic and amictic eggs are and know that amictics are diploid, mictics are haploid. Okay, we're going to end that for now, and I'm going to make another podcast regarding the mollusks. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you in class later.